Hi, I'm Josh, and welcome today to my updated Golden Girls book tag. We'll call this the Golden Girls book tag 2024 version. I made this book tag back in March of 2020. I was fresh on the booktube. My audio was horrible. It's still not great, but it's definitely slightly better. And I was also just not very, aware of what I like in reading. I don't think it was a very good tag. It was there, but the answers were I did not like them. I do not like the answers I gave. They were very mainstream. I cringe at that. Not just at the books, but at some of the questions. I feel like they could be improved, and I have. I've given 7 questions again. I know 8 is 8. And I've modified them slightly. Some of them are the same, some are slightly different. But I'm giving different answers for all but one, which we'll touch on when we get there. And I'm really excited to be giving this today. Should be coming up on Cheesecake Day in honor of Golden Girls. If you love Golden Girls, feel free to tag. I'm not going to formally tag anyone, but I'm excited to be back at this. I wanted to redo this one for a while. Without further ado, thank you for being a friend, and let's get on with our Golden Girls book tag.
Thank you for being a friend.
So the first change is going to be reorganizing some of the questions, starting with staying golden, because of course it's the Golden Girls. We're going to look for a book exploring aging and the golden years. So this obviously isn't much different. I thought it's still very much applied. And I also really could answer. That's part of why I changed some of the questions. I feel like it is better books for better questions. Being Mortal by Atul Gawande, still one of the best books I've ever read. Nonfiction, especially when it comes to about aging and the dying process. And I haven't read this in a long time, and I need to reread it. Every book I talk about here will be books that I think to myself, I probably should reread this, or most of them will be, with some caveats. This one looks at the life of this surgeon, the death of his father, but also his experience with people who have to deal with death, whether they're young or old. How do they approach death? How do we give them death with dignity? And what are the things that matter to them in the end? And really, the takeaway is almost always, regardless of age, what people value most is the human connections they have. Those are the things they want to help promote in those final days or final months or years. And that is just really impactful. This is a book that I think I'll be rereading, honestly, in the next year or two. So yeah, a book easy to recommend, one that is still fresh in my mind despite having read it several years ago at this point, I think. But as we went to question 2, Cheesecake, because we all love cheesecake. So I'm editing this and I'm realizing there's a better question I could have asked here for Cheesecake. Because before I did, what's your favorite reread? Or no, it was what your most recent reread was. And I was ready just to change it up, like what's a book you want to reread or something. And for Cheesecake, I think a more thoughtful question might be, what is it that you like most in the books that you read? What are your favorite kind of books to read? Things you enjoy consuming the most, the things you always go back to. And really, I think that is a much more thoughtful question. I wish I thought of when I was nice and dressed up while I was recording this. For me, this is, I think, a question I'm answering on the fly. I prepped all the other ones, I didn't prep this one. I gravitate mostly to speculative fiction, but I don't want to just say a genre, because it definitely isn't just a genre. I can get lost in a good idea that's fun writing easily, but I think what I really enjoy most are books that use a speculative concept in a very thoughtful way. I think there were great examples of this. You have On Kindness of Ghost, the book I was going to talk about here, about a space arc trying to go to another planet, and you have this sort of regression of society to this segregation of society and these statuses in this ship, various types of oppression, racism, slavery, economic inequalities. Interlaced into that is this larger idea, is this larger setting of space travel. Another one might be something like Kindred, a book that uses time travel in a very thoughtful way, but without even any real explanation of how it works, to basically immerse us into a very thoughtful and reflective scenario of this modern day Black woman having to go back to the Devil South, and then interwoven into that her husband at the time, and his experience as a white man during that same time, and the nuanced complexities that go on there. What other ones? I mean, anything Victor LaValle does is very thoughtful. Tanner Reeve Do. Basically, just any speculative fiction that I think not only has good writing, it has thoughtful speculative elements that I think are integrated well and believably. That's a big caveat there, making this world feel realized while also having a point behind it. I'm all for a fun concept, but it's when that concept is able to make a statement in a very effective way that I think makes a book excel as being the best of the best. But for this one, for me, it's definitely speculative books, fantasy fiction, horror, that has something to say with that. And of course, it's also fun to read. So yeah, that's my answer for this. I'm curious to see what other people have to say about this if you consider giving this tag a go. Then moving on to questions relating to the girls themselves, we'll start with Blanche, a book exploring queerness and sexuality. Notice this one's different because before it was sexuality and relationships. And I feel like I want to talk about queerness, and I feel like anyone talking about the Golden Girls should be talking about queerness because this is a queer icon. A queer icon show. Queerness is very present in this series. And while Blanche may not be the embodiment of queerness on the show herself, I think it's a good opportunity to talk about sexuality in general in the broader scope, trying to focus on queer things. If you're doing this updated tag, just keep that in mind. That's why I'm doing some slightly different changes. But for me, this one's going to be The Death of the Goji. And I am trying to be deliberate in this tag, not to talk about things I've been talking about a lot lately. And I just had, 10 queer books you absolutely need to read back in Pride Month in June. Still, it's hard for me to talk about books that deal with sexuality and queerness and gender identity. I guess I should also be here because queerness is a broad term. Without coming to this book, I am again another book that I need to reread drastically. It's been several years yet again. And it's just a beautiful story. I think it celebrates queerness and it's kind of tragic. It's not quite as uplifting as the Golden Girls, but it's beautiful, and I really think the girls would love this if they were to read this book. Probably Dorothy especially, but we'll save that for, why not? Dorothy. The Dorothy one is going to be slightly different too, a book that is deliberate and thoughtful with something significant to say. This is distinctly different from before when it was a book that made you feel smarter. It's a better way of thinking about books, besides made me feel smarter. And for this, I have to go with the duology Earthsea by Octavia Butler. Another series that I want to reread, although I've read it at least twice, maybe 3 times. But for me, this is one of my favorite series of all time. Like it's in my top 10 books of all time. And it's just the concept of Earthsea as a religion. God has changed. Everything you touch, you change. Everything you change changes you. Is just a core tenet that, as I've said before on my channel, has stuck with me. I'm not religious, but if I was, Earthsea would be the religion that I delve into. And it really is in everything that I do, everything I consume, all the people I expose myself to or I let myself, be around. It is a matter of asking myself, how will we interact? How will we impact one another? And how will that affect me as a person? And will it take me in the direction that I feel I want to be as a person? I just think it's really important to think about, short-term, long-term goals and the ways in which everything's connected, in the ways in which we can enact change and change can be enacted on us, and how we're not removed from being affected by those and the things around us. It's just such a powerful story. It's very present, obviously, as being a near future dystopia featured in, I think, literally this very year with the fascist dictator. Enough about that. A phenomenal series. When it comes to a thoughtful book, this to me is probably the most thoughtful one. It has had the most significant impact on me as a reader and as a person, honestly, outside of reading. Then going on to Rose, a book that reminds you where you grew up. This one I thought I wanted to change, but it still feels like the most apt description of Rose's character and how we can apply that to reading in our bookish thoughts. And for me, this is the one question I'm not going to change, but I have very deliberately chosen to stick with this because I have very different things to say about it. That is Fried Green Tomatoes at the Whistle Something Cafe. This book I literally just reread, and this book doesn't stand up. This book reminds me of home for multiple ways. One, it has that southern vibe, that southern almost, because it's like made in the 80s, but like I grew up in the 90s and 2000s, so like that vibe is still there. That southern hospitality, that southern charm of sorts, in some sense, even if that's sort of from a rose-colored glasses. And so there is that attachment where I can't help but feel like some of these people could be a part of my family. But then there's the other side, the almost dystopian, surreal side, where you're looking at this without the rose-colored glasses, of seeing the way in which it treats race, the way in which it tries to subvert racism, I guess, while simultaneously really being just another tool by which racism is able to to morph itself and to become more palatable as it sells narratives of, what's the word I'm looking for, of sugarcoating history, of convincing us of the things not being that bad, of things being better, of things just being a matter of disagreement, like of sugarcoating history and creating this narrative for white people to feel better about themselves and not have to reckon with the serious aspect of history of this part of the country and about the country as a whole. And when I talk about this being reminding me of home, it does. Like, it reminds me of the people, but it also reminds me of how insidious this type of rhetoric is. And it ties back to Earthseed. God has changed. Everything you touch, you change. Everything you change changes you. And the way in which these type of narratives shape people who are at best apathetic or at worst antagonistic to attempts to overcome the very real existence of racism today. Kamala Harris's rise as a candidate for the Democratic Party is the perfect example of that, as we see how the Republican Party and others are discussing her as a candidate, and from the most overt ways to the most subtle ways. And it's just very present. That is why I've chosen to keep this book. I didn't want to talk about it, at the same time, it's like this weird juxtaposition of feeling homely while also reminding me in all the most uncomfortable ways of why it felt homely, and not in a good way. Now moving on to number 6, Sophia, Picture It, a book that creates a vivid setting. Instead of a life story, I decided to go with a vivid setting. I struggled with this question, I'm not gonna lie. But for this, I'm going with a book I've talked about recently. It's actually a short story collection, Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang. And when it comes to vivid settings and or characters, I just feel like Ted Chiang has this ability to take a speculative premise and really bring it to life in a way that nobody else does. I've talked about him now, probably, this will make for 3 videos in a row. Like, this is just, I know what I'm talking about a lot, but it's just that creation of these worlds in such a compact space is so expertly done that when I think about like a vivid setting, that's one thing he's really good at. And not just creating the setting, but executing it. And I know people probably, when you think about this, you think about something like an epic fantasy like Brandon Sanderson, and I think that's a valid answer. Like, I understand that. I think this is a question of going different directions of what is it you value when you think about a setting and a world building. And this isn't necessarily that, but it's like a different way of looking at it, of being able to craft a very believable but very different world that is just slightly different from our own in very thoughtful ways. Hence me having to say Ted Chiang here. And then next up we have Stanley, a book you used to love and now hate or dislike. And obviously this is a slight change from before when it was a book you love to hate. And for this, I'm trying again not to repeat things or talk about things that I've talked about a lot lately on my channel. And so I want to go back to a book that I reread just late last year, which is Replayed by Ken Grimwood. And I actually have a full video back in, I think, 2 years ago, where I'm basically like a retrospective on some of my favorite time travel books. Some, me talking about why I loved it and thinking about why they succeeded. Others, why I loved it, but also why it really does not stand up. And I don't think Replay is the worst offender. At best, it is a cishet white man's dream of what you could do if you lived your life. And it's fun. It is fun, and it's an easy reread. This could be my Cheesecake if I wanted to be. But at the same time, it's very much white male gazy, and I just feel like it's an example of he has a really good idea. I think he's one of the first to do it. He even came out before Groundhog Day. But at the same time, it's just clear the perspective we're dealing with, and unfortunately how it's aged. I don't even hate it, honestly, because I'm still reading it, but there's a lot of that I dislike. And yeah, so I just want to bring that up. Again, if you've watched my channel, you might have seen that before, but that's something I've talked about recently. I do think time travel in general, a lot of my time travel favorites fit into this category of things that, I love the concept. I know I loved it before, but not so much anymore. It's just, when you see things in context to other things, it's hard not to look at it differently. Which is why I think it's actually a good way of approaching Stanley. You loved Stanley. He was there for you. He meant something to you. And it's weird to say a book betrays you, but it's a complex relationship. And I like Stanley for that reason. I think that's why this book and this question can work in that way. And then finally, thank you for being a friend. and for sticking around. A book featuring a strong friend group. For this, again, I thought about changing it, but I thought it fit. The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. Again, a book I've talked about recently on my channel, unfortunately. But when I think about this, it just seems like the best example of this for me. This book is very character driven. It's very much about this group of people on this ship and them trying to know each other, coming to understand each other, and us coming to understand them as well. Their history, their past, their nuanced complexities as characters. And if there's one thing that makes this book work, it's really those characters. And it's just the bond that they create. And like we're there watching this bond form. And it's really beautiful, and it makes this book one of my favorite of the year. When I'm thinking about this entire tag, I'm asking myself, a few years from now, I'm gonna look back at this and cringe as I reflect on how meh my answers were. And I'm hoping not. I feel more confident in my feelings. I don't feel like I'm about to have revolutionized the way I see these things. And I think that's sort of why I'm coming to this tag again, One Color Golden Girls, but also I just think it can be improved, both in my picks and also the way the questions work. If you made it to the end, thank you. If you're a booktuber, I'd love if you were willing to do the tag, consider yourself tagged. Anyone who's not a booktuber, I'm still curious if there's any questions that you thought of some answers to, like how would you answer some of these questions? Yeah, and as always, hope you have a great day and stay safe, and I'll see you all next time.
Your heart